Those of you that don't know me, my name is John Nazarian, and I'm president of Rhode Island College. It is my privilege to bring the greetings of the college and to welcome you to our 5th annual Spring Symposium on Diversity. We are honored to have with us this afternoon Marcia and Gillespie, editor-in-chief of Ms. Magazine, one of the most groundbreaking periodicals of the past 30 years, and certainly one of the most respected publications of our time. Ms. Gillespie will speak on the topic, Confronting Racism and Sexism Toward a More Humane Society. At the conclusion of her lecture, 2 distinguished alumni of the college will respond with their own comments. The respondents will be Anthony Maoni, class of 1975, Executive Director of the State Chapter of the National Conference for Community and Justice, and Christine Roundtree, class of 1979, Executive Director of the Province Human Relations Committee. I thank them for their participation in today's symposium. Also joining us this afternoon for the purpose of conducting follow-up workshops are Leonard Perry, Associate Dean of Student Life at Brown University, Carol J. Young, Deputy Executive Editor, The Providence Journal, Deborah DeBeer, Executive Director of the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and Maureen Reddy, Professor of English and Women's Studies at Rhode Island College. We thank them for their contributions to today's event. Let me also take a moment to thank our corporate and community partners. They include the Providence Journal, Cox Communications, the National Conference for Community and Justice, and the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence. We are most grateful for their support. 5 years ago, we formally established the college's Dialogue on Diversity as an ongoing campus-wide effort to focus discussion on diversity and inclusiveness. While we engage these issues in this academic setting, we are certainly pleased that the dialogue has extended into the larger community that the college serves. As we watch the evening news, as we read our morning papers, as we surf the web for the latest information, it is easy to become discouraged with a world that appears to be violent, hateful, and prejudiced. I want to tell you today, don't be discouraged. There are millions of small victories out there in the world each and every day. Progress made, attitudes changed, acts of thoughtfulness and respect and understanding that will never make the evening news. Do we have a long way to go? Absolutely, but we are making progress, one person at a time, one generation at a time, and I am confident of our eventual success. It is our hope that Rhode Island College's commitment to diversity in all its aspects will help promote the value of inclusiveness not only within the college community, but also to the community at large. We are very grateful for the dedication and hard work of the organizers of today's program and the participants of the program, as well as other programs offered as part of this series during the course of the year. Let me especially thank this year's 3 co-chairs of the Dialogue on Diversity Committee, Carol Shelton, Joseph Costa, and Amrit Singh. Let's have a hand for them. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to call upon Dr. Shelton to continue with today's program. Dr. Shelton.
Good afternoon. For those of you coming in, there are seats right here on the right and over on the far side of the auditorium. So please come in, find a seat, make yourself comfortable. Good afternoon to all of you. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker at this, our 5th annual Dialogue on Diversity Symposium. Last spring, as our committee was exploring possible lecturers, Donna Huntley Newby, my colleague in the Department of Nursing, suggested Marcia Gillespie. Her name was greeted with tremendous enthusiasm, and we were so delighted when she accepted our invitation to join us on this campus of Rhode Island College. I don't want to take excessive time from Ms. Gillespie's address, but I do want to introduce some ideas that I think are important for us to consider. She's a woman who has a wide range of interests that include both women's rights and human rights. She is a writer and editor. She is the editor of Ms. Magazine, the executive editor of Ms. Magazine, and prior to that, she had a similar position at Essence Magazine. Many of our younger students are only vaguely familiar with the forces that emerged in the last 3 decades of the last century that became known as the women's movement. Those of us with graying hair and the baby boomers among us remember the women's movement because it transformed our lives and changed forever the lives of all of us, both men and women. Ms. Magazine was and continues to be one of those forces that raised the consciousness of a nation to the gender inequality that existed in our society. Today, each of you has received a copy of the latest issue of Ms. Magazine, and if you haven't, I think that they are outside in the lobby over to my left. We hope that each of you will pick up a copy of the magazine. Ms. Today is an independent magazine. It is independent of advertising dollars. It is owned and operated by women, and it embraces a global perspective. It goes far beyond the stereotype of white middle-class feminist perspectives and redefines feminism in global, transnational contexts. How fortunate we are today to have as our speaker the pioneering Marcia Gillespie, who as editor of Ms. has taken the magazine in a new direction, forcing readers to confront issues of racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, and ageism. Would that she had the time to address all of those issues that dog our steps even into the 21st century. Today, Ms. Gillespie will link racism and sexism and help us to understand how grappling with these problems will lead to a more humane society. With the greatest of pleasure, I present to you Ms. Marcia Gillespie.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Not too well. Better? Okay, I just wanted to be sure. I want to say thank you very much for asking me to be with you today. I am, humbled and delighted to do so. I also want to say I'm knocked out by the fact that this audience is so wonderfully diverse. I'm particularly excited when I saw my young guys come in the room. I thought, whoa, okay, I better make sure I did good here. My father was from North Carolina, and one of the things he used to constantly tell my sister and I, he was a fortunate man, he had 2 daughters. One of the things he used to constantly tell my sister and I was that, as a man from the South, he thought it was very important that you learn to declare. And he always believed that it was important that you declare yourself. So just in case anybody missed it, I declare I'm an African American and I'm a woman. I say those things because each one of us could walk up on the stage and declare who we are in the context of the ways in which this country has defined our race, ethnicity, our gender, our class, our culture, our ability. The list could go on. So let me continue with my declarations. I'm a heterosexual, or at least I am now. One never knows. I could get lucky. I'm middle class, or so the IRS tells me. When I look at my bank account, I'm often doubting it, but nevertheless, that's what the IRS says, so I guess I have to take that. I am an educated person. So that on many levels, as a graduate of college, as someone who works in a profession, I'm a single person. I am a child-free person by choice. I guess in declarations, that kind of covers a lot of the territory that normally, hovers around the room. Now, in saying that, of course, every person, therefore, can pick one of these bags and decides that whatever I say at this point on reflects one of those bags that I've now brought up on the stage and unpacked. Or you can say, that was interesting. I never thought somebody carrying those bags would say all these things. And maybe we'll come someplace in between. But, this business of who we are in America is always such a tricky place. It's because it depends on who's talking and who's listening. It depends on how people interpret the baggage that's carried. And it also, of course, matters greatly what the baggage is of everybody else in the room. What do you hear? What do you see? What do you decide based on what you see about me as a human being? Well, let's be honest. Here we are in the zeros, the 21st century, the first decade of the 21st century, even though it really doesn't begin until next year. But we're gonna, we're gonna go along with the hype because it's simpler after a while. So here we are in the 21st century, and yet the sad truth is that so much of the baggage that we carry and the ways in which we look at each other in this room really is about 19th century think. It still very much reflects an America that we would like to believe has long since faded into history, but is as recent and in memory and in action as the need for people to come into the streets of New York City, as many of us have in the last several months, to protest the shooting of people who reach into their pockets for wallets. And it's decided based on the color of their skin that they must be reaching for a gun. It's as recent as the fact that in America today, when one looks at the face of poverty, what one sees are my gender and often my color as being the predominant face. Women like me with children in their hands. A 19th century reality that still continues to gain force and speed as we step into the 21st century. What we know, too, is that so often when one begins to talk about race in this country, it is through a very distorted lens. We still talk, it's so interesting, as if there were only two people in the room when the issue of race comes up. And of course, in the 19th century, like the 18th century, I think Americans were aware there were other people in the room. They certainly knew there were Native Americans there, if nothing else, along with these Africans who had been brought over in chains and the Europeans who had come here in hope. But our conversations about race, because it was that conversation about slavery and freedom, about how people were going to be assessed who had once been slaves, how America was going to treat them, that has shaped all of our dialogue about race. So here we are at the 21st century, and we still often discuss race as if there were only two people in the room, and one was black and one was white. totally ignoring the fact that, my Latina sisters and brothers are certainly gaining ground every day, that America is Asian, and it is, it is the face of the world in increasing numbers. I walk down streets in New York City, and my heart leaps with joy as I hear languages and see faces that represent every nook and cranny of human life on this planet, walking down the streets right along with me. America is a place where there are a whole lot of different people in the room, but we're still talking about it as if there were only two of us, and that the conversation had somehow stopped in the 19th century. We also talk about it in the 19th century way because every time there's a conversation, usually about race in this country, I can bet my bottom dollar that it's going to be something in which I, as a woman, I'm going to feel like, excuse me, where am I in this talk? Because whenever race usually comes up and they put the talking heads on the television set, the talking heads almost automatically tend to be men. As if race were all about manhood, as if race were all about what happens to men in this world. And yet, true, while we think of those, the symbols of racism, the most deadly ones are usually of the bodies of dead brown and black men. Women have not walked through and been immune. Racism affects us all. But the conversations still tend to be men talking, and people all talking as if this was still 2 centuries ago. Why do I talk about this? Because I think it's important that we really do make some decisions about where do we want to be in the conversation. Do we want to be back there, or do we want to be here? And the fact is, I don't know if it's even possible to divorce ourselves from back there, because the fact is we've never spent enough time unpacking those bags. We have never really wanted to address what happened back there, except I want to call it in the most cursory fashion. And I think in part because it's painful, and also because people immediately think somebody's got to start feeling guilty and full of blame. How often have I heard people say, but I wasn't even here. My folks didn't even come here then. We didn't have anything to do with that. And the truth is, no, you didn't. But we are all shaped by that still. And we're all touched by that, whatever that is. And the difficult thing for Americans all is an understanding that unless we can move to unpack those bags color our thinking, not just about those two people in the room, meaning me, the black person, and someone else, that white person. They color our thinking about everyone else who's in the room as well, to one degree or another, playing off different shades of beige and brown against each other, playing off on the notion that, there will be one good group of colored people and other not so good group of colored people. The idea is that we would stereotype, we stereotype one group, making quote-unquote Asians the quote-unquote model minority. As if, do you know what I mean? And if they're the model minority, then who in fact is supposed to be the dangerous minority? How do these stereotypes therefore influence the ways in which therefore two groups of people coming with their own histories of oppression, different places, for example, but still histories of oppression, meet in this land and move to cooperate? Can they really? We carry baggage that we need to think about how we pack and unpack in America if we are truly to move forward. When I was a child, I used to hear people like my parents say, well, everybody knows this is a white man's country. This is a white man's country. Which, used to be like one of those things people said with great bitterness when they weren't the white men in the room. This is a white man's country, but, the demographics are, it really isn't. This is going to be a country that's going to look increasingly more beige and brown and all chocolate and, lavender and pink and lots of things. But whatever that allusion to a past America was, it does not relate to what the America that we are all in process of becoming. So how do we, therefore, make this new America if, in fact, we don't do it by beginning to declare some truths about where we've been and where we need to go? So in addition to the truths that I talked about, which were just the what, kind of almost the what you see kinds of truths about the bags, I think that, I, like each one of us, has to also admit something that's very real. You can't live in this country where racism exists and not end up at least, with a bad case of halitosis. You can't, no one in America who's been in this country more than 2 minutes can walk away clean here. There are no clean hands in the room. We have all been affected and changed by the experience. Does not matter, and please hear me well, does not matter whether one has been active participants in the problem per se or merely passively, trying to get through one's life. It is like the plague. It affects us all. We have to be clear about that, because we have often wanted to take race in particular and make it as if the person who is the victim of oppression is somehow or other also supposed to be the solver of the problem. As if, therefore, the thing that made me, cringe back in the day, I do love that phrase. Every time I hear the, younger people talk about back in the day, I just crack up, because I'm one of them people from back in the day, you know what I mean? Because, doing for 50s. And so back in the day, when the civil rights struggle was moving along, one of the things that used to really, really, really annoy me was that there were people who actually thought, non-African American people, who thought what they were doing was for me. The soul you save is your own. What we don't talk enough about is the fact that we were moving to save America's soul, not my little colored soul. My colored soul was just fine, thank you very much. We were moving to save America's soul. And until we all get clear about the fact, that everything that we do, what I did in the civil rights movement, it was about saving me for me. But it had to also be that each person in that place and in that time should have been working to save themselves. The best we can ever do is to save ourselves. But we tend to approach race in this country as if it were always about doing something for the other person. We need to get honest here. This isn't what this struggle has ever been. It is a struggle that is about doing something for yourself. We need to be honest about the fact that when we talk about race as we move into these, zeros and beyond of this 21st century, we need to not only talk about it reflecting what it means in race and ethnicity for everybody that's in the room. But we also need to come clean, and I say this with all love in my heart, that my white sisters and brothers need to start talking about what it means to have white skin privilege, what it has meant to have white skin privilege. Because if you are not talking to as part of this conversation, we never get any place. It's so interesting, in the same way I'm always saying to men folk, when we start talking about the men-woman thing, that I'm always talking to men folk about what it means to be privileged as a man. What do you think you've gained? And also, what's the manhood box? Because, there is a gain, but there's a price. Now, what's the gain for having quote-unquote white skin privilege in this country? What's the gain and what's the price? I can't talk that talk. I haven't walked in those shoes. I have some ideas about it, but those are only ideas. We can't have conversations about race if the only person talking looks like me. We can only have these conversations in truth and in fact, that will make some significant change in what happens as we move forward if we're all talking about it and all talking from a real place of honesty and truth. We have to also talk about the ways in which we aid and abet it in a conscious and a not so conscious way. Now, I know, for example, I've been in rooms where I have heard my African American brothers and sisters say some things that I have thought were not cool. Now, I can admit that. Can anybody else admit that they've been in rooms where people have said some things that are not cool too? What is our job, therefore, if we are going to be, I call it, part of the solution and not the problem? Can we find our voices? Can we find our voices to say, I've got a problem with what you just said because you just smeared a whole group of people. I've got a problem with the idea that you think that this is okay. And let me be clear here, and I said it before, nobody walks away clean. So I don't think because, I have been oppressed as an African American, that gives me the right to decide that what I really want most is to be able to turn around and act ugly to somebody else because somebody acted ugly to me. I don't think that changes where we're going. And I say that because one of the sick things that happens in a society, which is sick itself, is that people often, do you know what I mean, feel like, if I could just take the burden of pain off me and put it on somebody else, it would be okay. If I could just pass it on, if there was another nigger in the house, somebody else that I could then, point a finger at. Isn't that the way in which heterosexuals therefore point their fingers at lesbians and gays? To have somebody else that you can say, you're it, but not me? Let me prove how normal I am, how just like everybody else I am? Well, let's be clear here. We all get involved in playing in that mud, and we've all got to do some work to make sure that we don't keep trying to pass the pain along. How do we pass the peace instead? We pass the peace when we dare to challenge those people, friends and family, co-workers, people we're just hanging out with, when those words, those quick words slide off their tongue. Because, I've always said to myself, all you have to do is replace, I want to call it the put down that's used about one group and put your own group in it. Trust me, somebody said it. How many times I know, do you know what I mean? When I hear people talking about, black people, I also know that many of those same put downs are used to describe women people. Do you know what I mean? Emotional. So emotional. I was in a meeting the other day, and it so struck me, in which someone said to me, Marcia, do you know what I mean? You were just in such a rage. I was like, no, I thought I was angry personally. I think I know what rage looks like, and believe me, you wouldn't want to see me go there. But it was, and I I thought to myself, should I really go where my heart is telling me to right this moment? And because sometimes we don't want to quote unquote raise stuff that might make people uncomfortable. And then that little voice that I'm trying to encourage to speak up a lot more, this little voice said to me, girl, you better get in there and say what you really think. So what I really said was, look here, wait a minute. Do you know what kind of signifiers those are? That, women, people tend to be people we think of as emotional, rage. I said, and then here I am, and I'm a black people too. And I know that that's a signifier that is often used when we talk about black people, that we are over the top. Now, the person who I said it to was clearly uncomfortable, The person was, I think, probably more than a bit uncomfortable. They became a bit angry, shall we say, that I had thought so little of them to bring it up. My point that I made to the person was, in fact, it's because I think so much of you that I bring it up. I think so much of you because I do believe that, in your heart, that's not what you meant. But I do think it's important that we be able to talk about the stuff so that we can move forward, because otherwise it's going to always be skittering on the table, coming up some other way. Because what I am trying to become in this 21st century is a little bit braver, a little bit more honest, a little bit more willing to take the risk of saying the things that too often don't get said in the room because we've been so trained to make nice, to keep the waters calm. But the truth really is that the waters often are better served when they get roiled every once in a while. Waters that are too calm tend to, attract a lot of things like algae and a lot of pond scum, and do you know what I mean? And they get clogged up and nothing much goes on and the fish start to die. What we really do need are waters that do roil sometimes, where we get a change, where there's a chance to refresh and rejuvenate that pond or that, do you know what I mean, or that lake or that space. We are, in fact, each one of us, therefore, agents of change. We each have the potential and the possibility to make the kind of change to create the world we've always said we want. I personally, I keep hoping that I'm going to live to be one of Willard Scott's people. One of those 100+ people that they put on there. I want my photograph. I'm serious. I want my photograph. I want them to say, she chases very young men. I don't know, something wonderful. Outrageous. Do you know what I mean? Dances every night or something good, But I know that though I intend and hope to live to be one of Willard Scott's people, I am not so naive as to think that the issues about race and gender in this society or in this world will have quote-unquote disappeared in my lifetime. I am not so naive to think that. But what I am fully committed to is, holding on to the absolute steadfast belief that, if we each stood with spoons in our hands, like digging at the mountain's going to crumble. The mountain will fall. It takes commitment, it takes time, and it takes patience, and it takes work. Now, the other part of this, which I have to bring into this room, is that, if we are having a 19th century conversation still about race, where only one person's talking and there seem to be only two people in the room and nobody wants to talk about privilege and people think they're just working for me. I know too that as a woman person, sometimes I don't know what kind of conversation we're having. Because on so many levels, the people who would be my allies on discussions about race will sometimes get mighty quiet when I start talking about issues about gender, as if suddenly the same truths don't apply, but I, have to say to people all the time, remember I declared, in case you couldn't see it, here I am, female today, or else in great drag, and, African American, not deeply tanned. Now, one of the things that, is real clear to me, and it used to, really ring bells to me all the time back in the day, even in the civil rights struggle, was that, again, it always seemed to me, like the decisions would get made, and the guys would go troop into the other room while the women were supposed to stay in the kitchen. And it's like, my feminism came directly out of that struggle because the truth is, the kitchen is not my favorite room in the house. Do you know what I mean? I like the stuff that comes out of it, but I'm not necessarily wedded to it. Do you know what I mean? Sinks and stoves and stuff, I think are way cute. Way cute, but So now, I never also could I understand the idea of why is it that we often want to act as if today the issue of race disappeared off the table, everything else would be fine. You know what I mean? But I'd still be female. I would still be in a world that basically has deprivileged me because of my gender. And if we're going to talk about freedom, how do we talk about freedom and do it in a half-step kind of way? So I was in trouble already back in the day when I realized my life was not dedicated to chicken. You know what I mean? It was not dedicated to chicken. I also realized, I was in trouble back in that day when I also, clearly understood that race was not a manhood discussion, that there were women in the pot too, and that clearly, even with that, if we do not address the issues that gender puts on each of us, we were only going to get halfway there. Now, it is fascinating to me that in these last 30-odd years that we have seen two things happen. Just as in that 19th century that I continue to refer to, where both of these movements for racial justice and gender justice, caught fire, if you will. That once again, in this last century, we saw these two movements catch fire. And unfortunately, they often seem to be on collision courses as they were in the 19th century. Now, I'm one of the first people who wants to say that when the women's movement started, this second wave of it in the last century, I was one of those women who went, I don't know about this. Because I didn't know whether those dolls were trying to take, we still had a party going on and it was about race. And I didn't know if we could stop that party to do, the woman thing. But then, of course, going and, being asked to be in the kitchen all the time began to make me think, maybe, no, we have to find a way to have this conversation too and at the same time. But, the collision course that was set out there still, in the 19th century is still very much part of, I think, what happened. In part, I have to go back to that thing about race that I mentioned, because a lot of my women sisters, my feminist sisters, my women movement sisters, also didn't understand that part of what you have to do, you just can't be born again, I want to call it a born again feminist, being a born again feminist, without also understanding that you can't blame race. That used to be one of the favorite things I used to hear women do. You can't blame all the bad stuff just on the men. Because, come on, other people got privilege too. Do you know what I mean? So I had a real problem, and I think that we need to talk about how, as we move forward in this with diversity issues, we as women have to be much more honest about the fact that our hands aren't clean either, just because we got born against feminists yesterday, But the other part of that conversation about women, was the fact and the truth that something profound was shifting in society. When women finally, the blinkers came off, and we finally were able to look at our condition and understand that what, had become, I want to call it the custom of the country, the customs of society, the customs of our culture, were in fact a deeply entrenched pattern of discrimination and sexism and oppression of us simply because of our gender. It's a great, amazing thing that's been going on in this country. And the fact that we have been so successful at it, of course, is perfect proof by the two backlash movements that have sprung up in response. The backlash against the gains made by civil rights in the form of affirmative action, the anti-affirmative action people, the backlash against the women's movement across the board, with all the anti-feminist rhetoric, the sense that we are supposedly living in a post-feminist era as if this was as good as it could get. My. The sense, too, that, the backlash as if every ill that has ever befallen this country in the last 30-some years is really because of those feminists. Do you know what I mean? As if that was the ultimate four-letter word in America today. All of these things, of course, mean that our challenges as we move forward are more acute. Because we have to be very clear, again, if nobody walks away clean in this about race, nobody walks away clean on this thing about gender either. It's not a discussion about women good and men bad. It is a discussion about how systems of power have given privilege to one at the expense of another. But even in that privilege, I came back to it, there was a price. Again, we have had for 30 years women having some bang-up great conversations about what it means to be female. We have been, redefining ourselves, with our words. We have given voice to things that there were no words for prior to what happened with this wave of the feminist movement. It makes my heart leap. But we need now to encourage, support, and push you, the men in this room, to have the conversations that you need to have about what does it mean to be male in society, about the pressures that are placed on you because of manhood and that manhood box that often tells you the ways in which you're supposed to order your feelings and your life, that often run counter to the basic instincts that you have in your heart and in your spirit. Until we get those same conversations going, again, freedom doesn't come just a part of us. This was not, as I understood the movement of feminism, a movement simply to lift the floor for women. It is a movement about breaking through the roof for men and women and all people, because we're all locked into boxes that stifle and smother us. Change is what we're talking about. And change means, quite frankly, struggle. And it requires that each of us in the room be prepared to struggle. But it's also time for guys to start talking about what it means to be men. How does manhood define you? How is it, how does it feel? How would you want to be if you didn't have, all of these prescriptions for how your lives are going to be? Now, I know some of you are saying, what does this have to do with diversity? Okay. Why I'm talking about all of this is that simply, when we get into conversations about diversity, we have to start from a place of who's in the room. I keep coming back to who's in the room. How are we going to define, do you know what I mean, what the ideal room looks like? Whether it's picking, students to come to the school and selecting through a whole lot of, applications, whether it's about you're the next person you hire at your job. You got to understand that all of these kinds of questions should be part of your process of looking at who you are and looking at who you want. If you don't start this way, what begins to happen is we move to the easiest place. What happens is we don't say to ourselves, wouldn't it be wonderful if in every kind of workplace we encourage men's groups? If we brought in speakers to talk about what does manhood mean? We're now working to keep workers harder than we ever had to before. And one of the ways in which we can work to keep people is by bringing things in that will help to enrich their lives and challenge their thinking. What if we started to talk about diversity, not just about how many people of which color were in the room, but how, in fact, are we engaging people who are already there in conversations about issues about race, about sexual orientation, about gender? We tend to want to think that the job is only about just identifying one from column A and one from column B and one from column C, and then pretending that we're just all going to get along because we're all in the room. And then when we find out that, people, of course, will try to do their jobs, but that's all. That, what happens in so many of the colleges that I visit, where I go in and I see we've made a real effort at bringing a lot of people from a lot of different cultures in the room, and yet when I go into the cafeteria, what I often see is white kids sitting with white kids, and black kids sitting with black kids, and Asian kids sitting with each other, and everybody forming up in their own little cliques, and nobody really moving to try to even get a sense of what that person who doesn't look like me or doesn't sound like me, or doesn't, dress like me, or does not have the same sexual orientation as I do, who they are as human beings. If we only go by the numbers, all we do is we continue to move forward with all of the same ugly factors that end up in violence and pain on our plates as we've had in the last century. We've got to do some different kind of thinking. And one of the ways in which we do that kind of thinking is by daring enough to move beyond, I even want to call it this false sense of political correctness that often keeps us from even saying some real truths that we need to talk to each other. You can't change people's minds if you don't even know what's on their minds. And too often, we're so busy not saying what we mean, what we think, what's really important, and that we're not engaging people and creating spaces, safe spaces, for people to really talk about where they're coming from, to really challenge their thinking on a regular and ongoing basis. And so we end up, therefore, still carrying on with many of the same attitudes, beliefs, and actions that marked our parents and our parents before them. How do we step out of the 19th century into the 21st? By daring to be different, by daring to accept the fact that change does mean that I might ruffle your feathers sometimes, that change does mean that we don't have to agree about things, but at least we have to be clear about what we think about things, that change does mean that we are going to have to get uncomfortable with each other, that change does mean that we have to really push people to challenge ourselves and each other to go beyond the surface. Because right now we're just treading water on this stuff. We've made nice surface change, but we have not gone beyond that. I want an America where people really can respect the differences of each other and be clear about the fact that it's not about shaping everybody to be like everybody else. That getting along does not require a homogenization of folk. that we really can have people who sound differently than we do, who have different thoughts than we do, who like different music, who dress differently, who eat foods that are different than us, you know what I mean, but are no more special or unspecial than us in the same room, and we are willing to be open to them. Think about it when you hire somebody, those of you who are in a position to make a hire. Think about it when you often look to the person that you want to, give a leg up in the workforce to. How easy it is always to go to what's comfortable. Well, what's comfortable is not necessarily what is best for you, or what's best for your company, or what's best for this country. We need to be uncomfortable. It can be such an exciting thing. And we also need to be something else as well. We also need to be honest about the fact that this business of diversity, and I know I was only supposed to talk about race and gender, but I can't do that in honesty and in fairness. This business has to go beyond that. We have to talk about class. Because in this country, everyone wants to pretend it doesn't exist, and yet the class lines are more deeply entrenched and ingrained every year. And they are, with all of these prejudices. The idea that, maybe it's the person who doesn't necessarily speak English as well as you do because their nouns and verbs don't match. That does not mean that person does not have intelligence, that person is incapable of doing the job. What it mainly means is that your ear is so attuned to thinking that means that that's special or not special. Why is it that we tend to now talk about people who are quote-unquote blue-class workers, and everybody gets a sneer on their lips or their faces? Why the jokes about blue-collar work are so often, considered to be absolutely fair and open for everybody to do. I come from people who work with their hands. I'm proud of them. They did honest work. They worked hard. I wouldn't be standing here today. And I have many cousins who continue to do that work and do it well and feel proud of the work that they do, and I'm proud of them because this country could not keep going every day if it wasn't for people who got their hands dirty while the rest of us sat around. But why is it? When we talk about diversity, we don't talk about the need to make sure that, people who didn't go to college are welcome at our tables, that people who didn't go to college are not, quote-unquote, dismissed disdainfully with those little sick jokes that we play. How do we, when we're holding community meetings, for example, and we want to poll the communities, when we want information about the clients in communities that we may serve, make sure that when we turn to the people who do that work to hear their opinions instead of just the people who sound like us and do the same kind of work that we do. That's part of what diversity means. And certainly I couldn't leave this stage without saying diversity also means being clear about sexual orientation. It is a sin that we may have abolished slavery. We have seen the struggle for one group of people, meaning my folk, African American people, to have full citizenship in this country, and yet we seem to be perfectly comfortable with the idea that we will deny full citizenship rights to another group of people because of their orientation. We seem perfectly comfortable in saying, well, no, they shouldn't be able to marry. They shouldn't be able to have, therefore, the kinds of sanctions and protections that other unions have according to the state because of something I read in a book that was done a long time ago. But that same book that was done a long time ago also said it was perfectly okay for people like me to be kept in slavery. That's what people turned to back then. Are we going to be held to that, or are we also going to be held to something that is the more pervasive part of that book that we all these politicians love to refer to, and that is to love thy brother as thyself? When do we, therefore, if we're going to talk about diversity, stop trying to make people who happen to love differently than those of us who are hetero, no better, no worse, just differently. Make them into the scapegoats that everybody can, pick on. How do we move to make that part of our diversity initiative? When was the last time do you make the place that you work in comfortable for people to be out? Have you, as a hetero person in this room written a letter to perhaps your employer to say, I think that people who, do you know what I mean, have same-sex partners should be covered by health insurance like everybody else? Have you written letters to the legislature saying, you know, how dare you deny citizenship from a group of people, the rights of all citizens to marry? Hello? If you're not, then you're part of the problem and you're not part of the solution. And I would also say, quite frankly and openly, do you know what I mean? And this is as a person, you know, this is a feminist, so I know that means the ultimate F word, y'all. But you know, as a feminist who's also struggling to be a Christian, and I know that many people use the faith as a way, Christian faith or whatever their faith is, as a way of keeping a distance to that. Examine your hearts, get down on your knees, talk to your creator or whatever that spirit, you know, is that guides you. And I think that you'll know in your heart of hearts that love is the basis of all religious, great religious thought and teaching. And love means being open to, you know, acceptance of others. So now, I'm going to leave the stage, but I can't do that without leaving you with one more thought. And that is, I've talked about struggle. I've talked about the challenges, you know, I mean, can you, you know, it's like, again, church I grew up in, we used to sing a song that said, you know what I mean, can you live the life you sing about in your song? Can you do the walk, you know, not just the talk? Because that's really the challenge for everybody. Everybody uses this diversity phrase. It trips off our tongues now so, you know, smoothly. You know what I mean? And everybody seems to, you know, oh, yes, diversity, but it's called but now how are you living it? How are you walking it? How are you making it real in your lives? And so I want to leave you with a name and a story from a woman who was a great hero of mine, and everywhere I go, I sing her praises. Her name was Fannie Lou Hamer. Many of you may know who she was. Some of you may not. I never assume. Mrs. Hamer. When the civil rights movement came to the Mississippi Delta back in the day, Mrs. Hamer, a woman who said maybe she got the equivalent of a fourth grade education because her family was poor and they were sharecroppers working other people's land. She and her husband raised their children on other people's land, bringing in the cotton. When the civil rights movement came to the Mississippi Delta, which was considered to be the baddest place to be, Mrs. Hamer was one of the first local people to stand to be counted to say she was going to, you know, try to register to vote. And because she tried, she and her family were thrown off the land that worked for decades. Mrs. Hamer, who continued to try to register, who continued to, you know, encourage her neighbors and friends to also become involved. And because she continued to stand, one night a group of men surrounded her on a back road and beat her almost to death, and she walked with a terrible limp ever since. Mrs. Hamer, who it never deterred, who continued to move tirelessly for freedom. Mrs. Hamer, who in 1968 led a delegation of Mississippians, black Mississippians, to the National Democratic Party to challenge the way in which delegates were chosen. And because she did that, it was the crucial step in changing the way delegates are selected, making the Democratic Party this, you know, rainbow that they like to talk about. It was a rainbow that began because one poor, semi-literate black woman from the state of Mississippi believed in something. Mrs. Hamer, when the, you know, feminist movement came along, was one, again, the first people I knew to get involved. And I remember when I still didn't quite understand what it was, Mrs. Hamer said to me, you know, baby, I may not be able to spell this thing called feminist, but I sure know what it means. And for Mrs. Hamer, it meant reproductive freedom for poor black women in the state of Mississippi, the freedom to have children and the freedom not. Specifically, though, for women who often went into hospitals to deliver babies only to come out to find out they had been sterilized against their will. She knew what feminism meant. She knew that feminism meant, you know, ending women's poverty. She knew that feminism meant ending the kinds of customs of the country that made it so possible to treat women like second-class citizens. Mrs. Hamer, who all of the years of her life struggled for justice, simple justice. Never got any richer, never saw all of the things that she struggled for achieved, but every day she got up and kept moving. And one day I said to her, how do you keep going? How do you do this? Because it's, you know, it's constant, the struggle thing. Don't you get tired? Don't you decide not to do it anymore? And so she said to me, listen, I'm going to tell you a story, and I think it'll answer your question. So I'll tell you the story. There was an old blind woman who was very wise, and people from miles away would come and ask for advice, and her reputation grew. One day, two people said, we're going to play a trick on this old one. We're going to catch a bird, and we're going to bring this bird to her, and we're going to ask her, is this thing in our hands living or is it dead? If she says it's alive, we're going to smother the bird. But if she says it's dead, we're going to let the bird fly free. A sick joke. They found a bird. They brought the bird held tightly in their hands, beak heart beating, to this old blind woman who's sitting on her porch. And they said to her, ma'am, this thing in our hands, we want to know, what do you think? Is this thing in our hands, is it living or is it dead? And the old blind woman, she sat and she rocked for a while, and finally she said, you know, I don't know. All I know is it's in your hands. Well, the moral of the story is very simple. We have a word, it's called diversity, but it's that bird. Diversity is the possibility of humanity really getting along. Do you know what I mean? In that simple way, that man whose, the memory of his beating will always be burned in our hearts in Los Angeles, who after it looked up and said, can we all get along? Diversity is about the possibility of recognizing the humanity in us all in the most possible way. Diversity is about recognizing how we have been privileged, and the idea, and recognizing too that we have an obligation to understand that our privilege can no longer come on the backs of somebody else, that we have to open doors, not close them. Diversity is about challenging ourselves in the ways we think about ourselves and about each other, constantly pushing ourselves to be bigger and better than we were the day before. Diversity is a commitment that you make to leave this place better than you found it when you came. That's what diversity is, and it's a bird, and it's in your hands. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I relate to what she says to our local community. Today, our first respondent is Christine Roundtree, who is the executive director of the Providence Human Relations Commission. She will speak first, and following her will be Tony Maoni from the National Conference.
Thank you, Carol. Can you hear me all right in the back? Okay. Ms. Gillespie, wow. I applaud you. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Christine Roundtree, and I thank you for asking me to speak here today. I'm honored. It is indeed a pleasure to meet Ms. Gillespie and to be on stage with my colleagues and friends. When Claire Eckert asked me to be a respondent today, when she told me what my role would be, I declined the format, but said I would take part in the program if I could speak to my own experiences from my life and from my heart. She agreed. My words will reflect my perspective on racism, basically, rather than sexism, and our mission to confront discrimination and evolve into a more humane society. Some of my words will be less than genteel, but then there is nothing genteel about racism. I used to be discouraged at gatherings like this one. We always seem to be preaching to the converted. As I've grown older, I realize that we need to be together from time to time, those of us of like minds and like hearts, to give each other strength and inspiration. We cannot change the world. We can, however, make a positive difference in the moments and the lives of others, and it is our moral imperative to do so. People have the right to define themselves. Strictly speaking, I am biracial. My mother is white, my father black. I also identify as black, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of choice, but never as African American, because that term does not reflect who I am. It does not reflect my heritage. So defining myself as black is closer to who I am, and I live between that description and that of biracial. You should know that the United States Census has never, to my knowledge, included biracial as a category. We have been relegated to the box labeled other forever now. Census officials include Samoan, Chamorro, Asian Indian, 5 or more Latin choices, but not American biracial. Being biracial, I have known racism by both sides. I have been called nigger by white people. I have been called half-breed by black people. Fitting in, having a sense of belonging, eluded me most of my early years. Not really this nor that, neither here nor there. I have finally grown into my identity. It was there all along, but I was looking for it in the wrong place. I was searching outside of myself. Anyone can be racist, and it is important to remember that although racism by the dominant culture, white society, has many more implications because that is where this country's power lies, and therefore the power to influence and determine major aspects of the lives of people of color, such as, but by no means limited to, the power to deny access to employment, home mortgages, and indeed in which neighborhoods one is allowed entry. Be mindful that, although less publicized, racism by black people against white people and others in America, it cannot be denied, it cannot be excused, nor can it be dismissed. It is all damaging to a greater or lesser extent. For every racist insult or affront or slight I have been subjected to by white people, there are probably 50 good encounters with white people that have led me to keep things in perspective. And that is the crucial point, a sense of balance. Being here today is like a homecoming for me. Rhode Island College was the turning point of my life. I began here in 1975 at 27 years old in the performance-based admissions program. At the time, Dolores Passarelli was head of the department. A friend I worked with helped me complete the application package, and with Dolores' guidance, caring, and good humor, I graduated 4 years later. Those interim years hold the key. Dolores was always there for me and always provided the support I so desperately needed. I, as a single parent with little, sometimes no money, trying to keep a household together while attending school and working, and dealing with a host of other problems. Times were bleak, but Dolores always had words of encouragement and practical advice, and it helped me more than I can say. It is due to her, Dolores Passarelli, that I graduated, and I thank you, Dolores. Professor Emily Steer Adler was my women's studies and sociology professor. Emily, a feminist, was my idol. She knew somehow that I needed a little different type of support than the younger students. She recognized this and she gave me her home phone number. She didn't seem to mind when I would phone with various problems or concerns, and I phoned a lot. She inspired me intellectually and politically, and her commitment to my education never wavered. Thank you, Emily. Professor Ed Sheff, who always expected ever more from me, thank you. I expect more from myself now. Mary Nocera, your warmth and good cheer made the days brighter. Dr. Scanlon, head of the infirmary, for 4 years you did everything for me but make chicken soup. And I think you would have done that had I asked. Your phone calls during the years just to say hello are so appreciated. Thank you. I offer my deepest gratitude to all of you. Thank you for your kindness. Thank you for your caring. Thank you for believing in me. It has all mattered. I should tell the audience that each person I mentioned is white. The lesson I bring is obvious. It is simple, really, ending or abating racism. It all begins with you, and it all begins with me. I owe much to the people here who, through God's grace, cared for me and about me, encouraged me, and made me feel part of something quite alien to me up to that point. Because of them, the course of my life was altered forever. Without them, I know things would not have turned out so well. The lesson is clear. It is difficult for a person to be racist against a group whose members treated that person well and humanely. Because so many people here took the time and had the heart to care about my success, their impact continues to be much greater than that of the lost and confused souls who live in the disturbed world of racist thought and action. Actions and words carry tremendous capacity to harm or to heal, to lift up the spirit or to tear it down, and the choice is ours. It all begins with you, and it all begins with me. The other part of the formula is confronting systemic change. To confront means to come face to face with something, presumably with the intention of somehow changing it. To change institutions, systems, and authorities, one must first challenge their structure. One must question their composition. I have told you how important this college was and is to me, and how wonderful the people here are. Still, apart from that, I must ask if the faculty and staff here are as integrated and diverse as they could be and as they should be. That is a valid question. This society needs that kind of scrutiny. Our society does not open the doors to its institutions to people of color and, to an extent, women, without loud and prolonged prodding. It all begins with you, and it all begins with me. If we do not beg the question, there will be no need for anyone or anything to alter the status quo. And change must occur if the phrase "one nation under God" will be meaningless for most of us forever. To close, I will leave you with words that guide my life, and I hope you will consider some or all relevant to your own lives and worthy of some thought once you leave here. 1, get involved and take a stand. Have a purpose. Make a positive difference. Challenge systems and authorities. In the words of the great James Baldwin, do what you can. Be a truth seeker. Remember to keep a sense of humor. Realize your responsibility to others. Serve a cause higher than self. Know that there are more good people in this world than the other kind. And always, always believe in miracles. Thank you.
I'm Tony Maione. I'm the Executive Director of the National Conference for Community and Justice here in Rhode Island. I get bonused every time I say that, so I say it a lot. As you can tell, I'm also a white male. Both my grandparents, both sets of grandparents, came here to the United States from someplace else, so I'm second generation here. And I practice humility. Every once in a while, actually more frequently than not frequently, God helps me to practice humility. He does things like put me third in a lineup that includes Marcia Gillespie and Christine Roundtree. And so I'm humbled. The mission of NCCJ that I talked about, to fight racism, bias, and prejudice, and promote understanding and respect among all people, also comes with a purpose. The purpose is to transform communities by empowering leaders to make change. I say to my board, about 2 years ago, we went out of the diversity business, I get their attention then, and into the change business. Well, change, as we have heard both my eloquent co-speakers say, is about truth. And so I want to tell you a little bit of the truth that I see, because really it's the only stock in trade that you can have as a white male who's committed to diversity. You have to tell the truth. So I want to first tell you the truth according to my daughter. My daughter is in the 8th grade. She's just delivered to me her 16th quarterly report card of nothing but straight A's. She's a wizard at math and science. She has incredibly high expectations of herself, including getting herself up early in the morning and budgeting her time for preschool homework as well as post-school homework. And so I think about her and I think about what her expectation might be for the workplace that she's going to face. And her expectation, I have to tell you, is not about yes, but. Her expectation is not, we will hire you, but we won't pay you the same. She's not going to be happy to be paid 80 cents on a dollar against her male counterparts. She's not going to settle for yes, but. She's not going to want to go to a company that says, yes, we'll hire you, but we won't promote you. We won't mentor you. We won't give you opportunities to do new things. She's not going to do that. And she's not going to work in any organization, believe me, this I know, that says, yes, we will hire you, but we won't allow you to lead. She's not going to have that. And so when I talk to her about this work, I say, Anna, I'm giving a speech. I'm going to be presenting at a workshop. Would you like to come? She says, no, Dad, that's your work. And I really think about that because indeed it is my work, given not only my job, but my position in the world, the people who relate to me in the world, and the positions that they hold in the world. And so my work is about two things. It's about being a skunk. I am the skunk at more lawn parties than you can imagine. Because when you tell the truth, you can be a skunk. And the other part of my work is to be a bridge. And I want to tell you just a little bit about both of those. I want to tell you about an organization that we worked in where we got hired because about twice a month they were spitting women into the Human Resource Department with complaints of harassment. About 2 a month. They had recently settled a lawsuit. Leadership was largely, almost entirely male, with the exception of the head of HR, who herself was sexually harassed by the chairman of the board. And so we got hired, and I came in to do a presentation about a change model. You can't buy diversity training from me unless you're talking about changing your company into something else that it's not now. And so we didn't come in to train. And I was laying out for the corporate leadership of this company what a change program would look like. Leadership commitment, strategies, policies and procedures, and a way to really make this a place where all people could feel included. And there was one executive sitting there with his head down, doodling on his paper. Now I have to admit, he was getting me angry, and maybe the force of what I said to him came out of that anger. But this was also a company where I knew one of the middle managers had in his office a picture of Miss November on his wall, where they were spitting out women 2 at a time into their human resource department on sexual harassment, and he's doodling. And finally he looks up and he says, I just don't get what you're driving at. Well, I mentioned, my grandparents came from another part of the world, and I'm half Italian, and if the Italian temper didn't get him, then certainly the French-Canadian temper did, because he snapped me. I said, sir, let me explain to you what we're doing here. You're spitting out women 2 at a time into the Human Resources Department on sexual harassment. You've settled the lawsuit already, and thank God it wasn't huge. And you got some dude in this workplace who's got a picture of Miss November on his office. You have serious strategic problems in this company. as they relate to women and most likely diversity in general. I am giving you a systematic way to change and approach diversity in your workplace. You tell me what it is you don't get. You ask me a specific question, please, so I can answer it. He went back to doodling on his paper, and I stopped him. I said, well, wait, because if this is about you don't want me here, I'll go now, if that's the consensus of the people in this room. Let's just tell the truth. And the CEO intervened at that point and said, very politely, Mr. Maione, we'd like you to stay and work with the group. And I did for the rest of the day, but we never did complete that contract. I wish I had a success story behind it. I guess the best I can say is we got paid in advance. You see, that's what it's about. It's about telling the truth, especially for somebody like me, to somebody like those other white male executives. But it's also about being a bridge. We talk about building allies in the workplace, but really I don't know that that term does it for me. Because an ally is someone who supports somebody else while they do the work. We support women and we support people of color while they do the work. I don't know that that's the word. If I think about what the Allies did in World War II, it's more like that. And so what I try to do is I try to be a change agent. I try to develop people who are going to make changes now, serious changes in the way that they deal with people. My job is to help the white males in the company who hold positions of power, and if you look at the Fortune 500, we're still at 1 or 2% women and people of color in CEO positions, to move those white males forward in opening up their workplace. Well, why are they going to do that? Why in the world would they always have this discussion about, well, it's not going to benefit me? I say, well, you're the CEO. It's not going to benefit you. What is your job here? Is your job here to look at the future of the company and make sure that this is a viable, ongoing, lucrative organization 50 years from now? And they like that. You know, that's the vision thing. They say, yes, that's my job. They say, well, let's take a look at what the vision of the future looks like. And you've heard some of the data, but the vision of the future is much more diverse than it is today. People of color and women, very soon, make up the majority of new hires coming into the marketplace. The world is shrunk. It is tiny. I made a comment about gays being accepted into the Boy Scouts that got picked up in Rolling Stone magazine. Me, down here in Little Rhode Island. Tiny world. So we have to make room for the voices that are coming our way. So that's about a diverse market and a diverse workforce. But it's more than hiring. And it's more than about access to the markets. Because people who come do not want to be the color that sits in the window so that people can see them and think we're a diverse company, nor do they want to be your access point to a market. They don't want to be the Latino or the Spanish-speaking employee. They want to contribute to your company the same way my daughter wants to contribute to your company, because she's a leader and she's bright and she's articulate and she can pull your company so much further if you'll just give her that opportunity. That's where we're headed. Ultimately, it's about the way we make decisions in companies. And there's one piece of information I would leave you. If you have a simple problem to solve, by all means, have a homogeneous team. Put people of like mind around the table, you'll get that problem solved pretty well. That's what the studies show. But if you have a complex problem to solve, and I don't know any important problems anymore that aren't complex, the more diverse your team is, the better the opportunities you will have to solve that problem in a way that makes sense. But you have to tell the truth. I sat with one group and they said, we are committed to diversity. And I said, how do you feel about conflict? And they said, oh, we hate conflict. I said, then you're not prepared for diversity. Because when you tell people to come, they're not going to come and sit silent for very long. Not anymore. And so in the future, if we discriminate, we lose. Companies that embrace diversity, understand it, and work to have other people's voices heard, win. And at that time, when that happens, we will indeed have a future of America which is better for all of us and not just for some of us. Thank you very much.
I know that many of you have to leave for 2 o'clock classes, but I think that we might be able to stay here for a few minutes anyway for those who might have questions. But at the moment, if we could just give a good round of applause to our speakers here and thank them for all of the inspiration that they gave us today. Could we take, I know students are off to the 2 o'clock classes, but if there are any people, we do have microphones here for maybe 1 or 2 questions. We will certainly, we were hoping to have a bit of a dialogue, and yes, here is one.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Should be on.
I don't think it is.
Yes, it is.
Is it? Okay. Hi. Ms. Gillespie, thank you. As a gay man, thank you so much for all of your words. They're very, very important and they're necessary to hear. And Ms. Roundtree, I am not unlike you in that I came here 4 years ago as a PBA student at 25, and now I'm graduating this year, almost 30, with as the Sasasqua International Fellow in Anthropology to the American University of Cairo. So this is a place of transformation, and I applaud it. And we have a wonderful program in African studies here, and we have great people who teach in it. My question to you, Ms. Gillespie, is just about institutions of learning. And far too often in places like Rhode Island College and places all over the country, we have people who, when you study works like Derek Bell or Delgado, people like that, people in academia say, well, that's not science, or that's not academic enough, that's activism, or that's ideological. And we need some answers about how to deal with people who have that perspective, because they are the crusty people who hold those offices in those places that obstruct people who want to have a conversation and people who want to advance forward all of these problems that racism and sexism and homophobia bring to our society. And if we're making citizens here as a part of the college community, what do we do about those people who refuse to participate in the conversation?
Well, you know, I wish I had some real simple answer for you. I don't. I think, though, that there are 2 things that we do. One of which is you don't let, them stop you from having the conversation. One of the things, and I go back in the day, was that, students often did, which was very effective, is to also hold, I want to call it, their own classes, to hold, discussion groups outside of the academy when the academy did not wish to accommodate, do you know what I mean, the discussions that we wanted to hear. I think that, one of the things we need to remind ourselves is the fact that, the learning experience happens both within the classroom and any place else we deem to make it possible. That's A. The B is you need to challenge your administration. If there are people who are obstructionists, you need to challenge the administration about, the fact that this is going on. Because, you can't assume that everybody knows it. So first off, I always say, speak truth to power. Talk about it, raise the flag, don't be silent about it. That's real important. Make people uncomfortable. That's a good thing, And then it's because the one thing you can't afford to do is just sort of say, well, that's just the way things are. Yeah.
I think that we have some young students. I think they're from the Wellspring School. Would like to hear your question. Speak right up.
Thank you, Marcia Gillespie. I have a question for you. When you were a kid, did you ever want to play sports? And if so, did people tell you that you couldn't because you were a girl or black?
Yes, when I was a kid, I did want to play sports, and there were, I want to call it, there was not a lot of encouragement for girls' sports at that time, because I was a kid long time ago. Do you know what I mean? That there wasn't the same encouragement for girls to be athletic as there was for boys. And so there weren't a lot of options for like team sports for us. We often just sort of did pickup games on our own. And I always resented that. You know, while I don't think I was ever, got cut out to become like a great athlete, I think I could have been a lot better than, some of the people who got time, to play. I think that that's an exciting thing about what's changed for girls, is the fact that, you're encouraged to be strong and smart and bold and to play sports and to just go for it, But I think that the other part of it is, it's not just about the sports. I think it is about just encouraging girls, like boy people, to also just find their spirits and express themselves in the ways that, make you feel whole and healthy and strong, and that you can do anything, because you can do anything.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to remind people to put their evaluation sheets on the table as you leave the auditorium. There are workshops beginning in about 10 or 15 minutes. Oh, do I have another question here? Oh, I'm sorry.
Is this working?
It should be. Just speak up.
I want to declare myself. I'm a Jamaican woman. I came here 9 years ago. I'm the mother of 4 kids. I have a 17-year-old stepdaughter, and I have a 6-year-old son, and I have twins. They're 4 years old. I'm also a student here at Rhode Island College, full-time. I want to know, I've worked for a number of years. I've actually not working now. But I really want to know, how does a black woman ask for a raise when she knows that she's doing a good job?
Did you say, how do you ask for a raise?
Like you're asking and you're showing that this is what I'm doing a good job, everyone, but they don't give you a raise that is equivalent to the kind of work that you're doing.
In all seriousness, I will say to you that I work for local government. I need someone to answer that question for me also, so I'll pass it to Ms. Gillespie.
I always start by, we often have to do comparative. Yes. Are other people who are doing the same work being given raises that are more than what you've been offered?
Yes.
Yes. Can you know what I mean? I would start from that place. I would say to them, I really do, need to understand this. Do you know what I mean? When I've done, they do reviews in your workplace.
They do reviews and they go over, and this is why I'm not working right now, because I just realized I need to step back so I can move forward. But I'm going to be going into the workforce in another year or so, and I don't need to be there when I go back. But they do yearly reviews, and I've worked at this place for 4 years. They do yearly reviews, and my evaluations are really, really good. But I never get compensated based on my evaluations.
Well, sometimes, it's often important, I want to call it to document. One of the things that we know is that people talk. How everybody says people don't talk. People talk about how much money they get. They talk about what their raises are. And one of the things that you come to a place, now you have to also decide, are you willing to take the risk? But the risk is to say, I'm not really clear here. You've been giving me these really great evaluations every year, and yet when the time comes for a raise, you consistently give me less money than you've given X and Y and Z person. And I just need to understand, what's going on. That now you've asked people to, you made it clear that something's going on. That they're not paying, that they're doing a double standard here, or you feel that way. Put their feet to the fire. Do you know what I mean? Yes. The other thing that I've always thought is very important, me personally, is never wait to have somebody else tell you how much you're worth. I've always gone in for raises with a figure I have written out in my head of how much raise I want. Because, sometimes, it's like always waiting for people, sometimes, like to recognize you, that they often don't, they don't recognize your worth because they don't think you know what your worth is either. So therefore, it's like, and I usually come out with one that's outrageously high. They may not meet that, but they're certainly not going to perhaps slide back down to where they may have started. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So also, claim it, girlfriend.
I have just one short follow-up question, because the response backward is, well, you don't have a degree, although you're doing the same work and more than the other person. How do you respond to that?
I talk about the work, not the degree.
Okay, thank you.
You talk about the work, not the degree, honey.
Thank you.
All right.
Can you make it quick?
I'll try. Good afternoon to the panel, and thank you. What I want to say revolves around 3 words: empowerment, self-esteem, and internal power, not external power as exhibited by money, your position, your career. I truly believe that if there was no external diversity visible, if we all looked alike, if we all talked the same dialect, if we all had approximately the same intelligence, there still would be, what's the word I'm looking for? There still would be groups that needed to feel better than other groups. They'd find, if we all looked alike, talked alike, they need a reason to feel better than. That leads me to empowerment. The answer to all of this, I truly believe, is we need to bring up our babies, regardless of whatever race we call them, to believe, to empower them, to let them know that whatever anyone tells them, that they are good, that they are worthwhile, and they have a lot to contribute. And if they grow up feeling that way, as Oprah Winfrey says, I used to sit on my linoleum floor. I was a little colored girl, her words, born in 1954, sat on my grandmother's floor and listened to the radio, and I was told I was a colored girl, and I was no good. But I didn't believe it, and I didn't believe it because my grandmother didn't let me believe it. And I contrast that with a very wealthy white woman born at approximately the same year, Christina Onassis, wealthiest white woman in the world, who committed suicide. Where did Oprah Winfrey's empowerment come from, and where was Christina Onassis's lack of empowerment?
I'm going to have to make this quick.
I do hear you, and I think that it is very important that we bring every child into this world feeling loved and supported and affirmed. I think that's really true. I also know, though, that, if you're going to tell me, I think that along with that, we have to be real clear about the fact that change is both an external and an internal and an external. So that what also happened for Oprah Winfrey, in addition to the internal messages that she took, was that we changed society so that a little colored girl like Oprah Winfrey could also have access, have doors that she could walk through. So I know that, while we're working on this and creating, making every little light shine if we can, we've also got to be very clear about the fact that, there are many children who are growing up in places of great stress and conflict and chaos. That, that much as we would want them all to, we'd want all children to be born in the best of circumstances and times, and they're not. So while we're doing it with our children, we still have to raise the floor. We still have to raise the floor.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. We hope that some of you will be at the workshops. And again, thank you so much to all of our speakers, particularly to our main speaker, Marcia and Gillespie. We are so happy that you were able to come. Thank you.